Well, welcome everyone to our 2023 Rebele Symposium entitled Covering Tech, Finding the Signal in the Noise. I'm Janine Zacharia. I'm the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer in our Department of Communication, and we're very pleased to be here this year in person for the first time since March 2020. I believe our Rebele Symposium that year on March 8th may have been the last in-person event at Stanford before the COVID lockdowns. And we're especially happy to welcome Mr. and Mrs. Rebele back to the farm. Thank you for making this program and the Rebele reporting internships, which I know we're celebrating tomorrow, possible. We're thrilled you're here with us. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Mark DeZuti from the Communication Department for helping with the logistics for this event. Nothing happens without Mark. And of course, Professor Jay Hamilton, the chair of our Communication Department and the director of our journalism program, for his outstanding leadership. And I am grateful, Jay, every day that I get to teach in a department and a program that you oversee. A few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded and live streamed, and we will be engaging in a conversation for most of the first half, perhaps a bit longer, but then I really want to involve all of you in the audience. So there will be, some of you already got index cards. There's index cards in the back. And then Mark will be bringing them to me at some point during the program. Now, we explore many topics in journalism through our Rebele Symposia, but this year, as Jay and I were brainstorming on what to do, the tech beat felt particularly important to explore. How technology is impacting the way we live, obviously, is a paramount story of our time. Making sense of the acronyms like AI, VC, NFT, FTX, that one day can be full of promise and the next fraught with peril, is definitely a reporting challenge. Determining which and how to tell the crucial Silicon Valley stories amid increased scrutiny of how innovations and their innovators, I'm looking at you, Mark, Elon, impact our world for better and for worse, is a huge opportunity, but also an enormous responsibility. And so we are very fortunate to have three stellar journalists who are tasked with this challenge back here on the farm. In alphabetical order, the way end, Lauren Goode is a senior writer at Wired, where she focuses on the intersection of new technologies and humanity. Her coverage areas include communication apps, AR and VR, subscription services, data, and how Silicon Valley culture shapes the products we use. Prior to Wired, Lauren worked at The Verge, Recode, and The Wall Street Journal, and she is a 2014 graduate of our Stanford Journalism Master's program. Christina Passariello is the technology editor in the middle at The Washington Post. She oversees a team of 20 reporters and editors in San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington on the tech beat. She previously worked at The Wall Street Journal, most recently, I guess, as deputy tech editor. And prior to San Francisco, Christina was the European fashion and luxury correspondent for the Journal, which I'm bringing into our conversation tonight. So I wanted to point that out. She was also a foreign correspondent in Paris and London, and she was a John S. Knight Fellow here at Stanford from 2014 to 2015. Last but not least, Zoe Schiffer is managing editor of Platformer, a new independent newsletter by Zoe and her colleague Casey Newton that follows the intersection of Silicon Valley and democracy. Before that, she was a senior reporter at The Verge, where she focused on tech labor and workplace organizing, and she previously worked as a freelance journalist for Vox and the San Francisco Chronicle. She started her career as a content manager at a startup and a UX writer at Uber, and she is a 2019 graduate of our Stanford Journalism Master's program. So please join me in welcoming our three esteemed panelists. So in the conversations I had with each of you before the program, I threw out a macro question about what's top of mind for you, how you see the mega story of tech today, and you all had similar and different and equally compelling answers. So I'm excited to explore each of these with you. But before we get into that, let's just start with a basic question of how you got into this coverage, into this beat. We have many journalism students in the audience and watching online. You each took a different path. And so say a few words about how you got to the tech beat and a little bit what your day is like, because I know a lot of the journalism students will be wondering. And I want to start with you, Zoe, because you came into our program like Simone, who's here tonight, transitioning from a job in tech saying, I want to do tech investigations, I want to write about BS and labor relations. You were very focused. So talk about that whole trajectory.
Yeah, I think both Simone and I really saw ourselves as writers, but the jobs available when I graduated college really seemed like they were in tech, and so I had a pretty rosy idea that I would start out and do a couple years, and then when I could afford to transition to a full-time journalism job, I would just hop over, no problem. And that is not how it happened. When I'd worked for 2 years as a UX writer at Uber, which was a really great experience and one I enjoyed, but felt very disconnected from how I saw my identity. And when I started applying to journalism jobs, I was kind of in a weird middle ground where I didn't have enough journalism experience to come in as a full-time writer, but I wasn't so junior that I would be an intern at that point. And so it really wasn't until I got to Stanford and really focused, I'm gonna take this year and freelance as much as I can and learn as much as I can from Janine and others, that I was able to really seamlessly kind of make that leap. And I really did take the year to just write as much as I could. And honestly, having that credential next to my name, I think made my story make sense to a lot of people all of a sudden.
Christina, you came, like I said, via foreign correspondent, my bailiwick, and fashion and other things to tech.
Yes. So when I came to Stanford to be a Knight Fellow, I moved from Paris, and it was a little bit of a test of moving back to the U.S. after 15 years abroad. And I really loved being back in my home state of California. And so it quickly became apparent to me that that I wanted to stay in California. And so I had been with the Journal abroad, and so began talking with the Journal about transitioning to a role out here. And so that was, very obviously the tech industry, which I was totally fascinated by because, I'm slightly older than these two lovely ladies.
Not me.
But so I grew up with this idea of tech journalism from the early 2000s, where it was if you weren't into gadgets, it wasn't for you. And so I just, I just didn't identify with that. But by the time I came out here in 2014, 2015, tech was everything. And I really just was totally fascinated by that. So, so that was how I got into tech journalism.
Lauren?
I don't want to embarrass Zoe, but I will say that when Zoe was in her phase of talking to lots of outlets about jobs, she did apply for a fellowship at the Wired Consumer Tech Desk, but she was so focused on labor and already had so many impressive clips that we thought, well, she's probably not going to be happy on this desk, right? Is this the right role for, but she was so impressive. Anyway, in Pretty Woman, when she goes back to the store and she goes, big mistake, huge. That is how I feel about the fact that we have not yet snagged Zoe, because she's amazing. But yeah, like Christina, I think I had a somewhat similar idea of an entry, gadgetry and personal computing being an entryway into tech journalism. I started out as a video journalist. I started working in 2003. First, I worked in a sports newsroom. Then I eventually made my way to the Wall Street Journal, where I was sort of a generalist as a video journalist. But I got sent to a couple of tech conferences as a video journalist, and it really sparked something in me. And this was around 2008 or 2009, when Web 2.0, and particularly the mobile web, was really sort of in the upswing. And I remember going back to headquarters and saying I want to cover tech, because I was so interested in what was happening with the App Store and Twitter and Uber and even geolocation services, and the way it was sort of changing our relationship to data, and how we had these GPS devices in our pockets all the time, which was kind of creepy, but still is. But anyway, eventually I ended up transitioning full-time to writing, and that was how I ended up on the consumer tech beat.
So we're not leaving here without talking about third love, Zoe. So we'll do that later, I promise. Okay, we'll come back to that. All right. There's a story about when I was working with Zoe on her master's thesis, and I had to really be the bad cop. And I think she was quite upset with me, but I think she's not upset with me anymore. So I want us to tell that story later. Okay. All right, Christina, you told me when we were speaking about how this past year has proved that tech stories are as big as any story in journalism these days. What do you mean by that?
Well, Elon Musk taking over Twitter was kind of the alignment of so many different threads across our society. for those of us who follow tech, he's been a very big figure in tech for many years, but he's really emerged as, a political and cultural force in the last several years. And so, his interest in taking over Twitter, which as a platform, doesn't have the reach necessarily of some, Facebook or TikTok or things like that, but it's so influential because of the people who are on it. So, that was just an incredible story that lasted, for most of last year. And I think it was, we'd seen the interest in Musk, like this just fascination with this personality, and like the interest that would just kind of follow everything that he did. So, by the time that we got to the fall, and we had, would he or wouldn't he take over Twitter? Was it going to go to a lawsuit? Was it going to go to a trial? And all of that happened right around the same time as the midterms. And it was so interesting to see that, at the Post, where politics is the bread and butter, interest from readers was actually higher in the Musk Twitter stories than in the midterm stories. So that was a real moment for our newsroom. But really just, in a way, I wasn't surprised by it because what happens on Twitter and what he does actually, it's very much part of the national conversation about politics, about culture. It's so far beyond, a business or tech story.
I want to come back later to the Silicon Valley DC divide, and of course we're the pregame, as my friend Linda said, for the State of the Union tonight. So I want to talk about whether this is the year that Washington will actually get tough on tech. Haha. But I want to come back to that. But I want to note that when I left the Washington Post from Jerusalem and moved here in 2011, there was nobody in San Francisco.
Right.
And now Christina oversees 20 reporters that cover tech, in Seattle. Here and
actually, I realized my bio is out of date because there's 35 now.
35, okay. Just to give you a sense, a data point to really illustrate what you were saying, but the interest in Washington and tech here.
One of the things I'll note too is, so Christina and I overlapped at the Journal, though we were in different bureaus. I was in New York and Christina was in Paris, and at that time in the early 2010s, I'm sure you remember this, tech was in what we called the C section of the paper, very unfortunate name, but it was the C section of the paper. And now, I haven't worked at a paper in a long time, but more often than not, the tech stories are above the fold on the front page. They are A1 stories. They're in it's affecting every sector. It's healthcare, it's autos, it's everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, when I did the 2017 McClatchy Symposium, it was about foreign correspondence, and I said I didn't want to spend the whole night talking about Trump. And so today I don't want to spend the whole time talking about Elon, although we have to talk a little bit about Elon. Zoe, both you and Lauren talked about this relationship between the CEOs and the workers and how that's changed over the last few years as being the main story. And you have a big piece in New York Magazine and on Platformer talking about, which Platformer won, about why actually CEOs are cheering for Elon and how he's sort of cracking down on the workers. Talk about that, and then Lauren, how you see that balance of power.
Yeah, I'm curious, Lauren, what you think about this too. But from my perspective, and really starting in 2018, there was a shift in the balance of power in Silicon Valley, and it really started to get more concentrated in the worker class. People were calling out their companies very directly for what they saw as hypocrisy in their diversity and inclusion efforts. Sexual harassment scandals were coming up again and again, and it felt like CEOs were actually having to make concessions to those workers. We saw companies like Google cancel major projects because workers demanded that they stick to the mission statement that was all over the company walls, don't be evil. And I think workers wanted more freedom, they wanted more autonomy, they wanted more of a voice. I think what we've seen, both because of kind of the overall economic reality right now, and Elon Musk kind of being the vanguard of this, is a shift where CEOs are kind of saying, look, we gave you all of these concessions, you still weren't happy, you were complaining all the time, now we're gonna take it all back, no perks, if you're not happy, you can leave. And the reality for many workers is that the jobs are drying up, it's much harder to get hired. We've seen almost every big tech company have major layoffs this year. And so I think there is a very tangible effect that even some of those symbolic wins that workers got are being taken away.
Lauren, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Zoe, you cover labor so closely, and you're so tuned into what the workers at some of these companies are saying. Like, I think that there's definitely a labor story here, and it's so interesting to me how the tech trends have been incongruous with the broader economy, because the US economy keeps adding jobs, and meanwhile tech is freaking out and saying we must lay people off after this incredible run of earnings for the past 2 years. I think there's something else there too that's related a little bit more to the tech CEO, like our relationship to hero worship and the tech CEO. We've been covering tech in these time periods where often we're presented with new technologies and they are incredibly complex. And when things are complex, they're hard to understand, whether it's the mobile revolution, 15 years ago, or whether now it's the emergence of crypto. We often look to leaders, consciously or otherwise, to say, show us the way, explain this to us, tell us what to do. And so we have done that. We as a society, we as the media, we as tech workers would look to CEOs for that kind of leadership. And I think that attitude is what's changing a little bit. I think that there's a little bit less sort of unwavering trust that what the leader of your company is doing is actually the right thing, and workers are feeling a little bit more empowered to push back.
But there's sort of two things going on here. So you're saying they're feeling more power to push back, and you're saying the CEOs are sort of reclaiming the mantle of no, I'm the boss. Like the Palantir CEO said in Davos, you don't like what we're doing with the government? Go work somewhere else.
Yeah.
He didn't have those kind of comments 2 years. Google was having town halls, freaking out when people got upset.
I mean, I think we're just in a more honest version of Silicon Valley. These companies have always been corporations at the end of the day. I think it's ironic that one of the big criticisms that we have against Meta and Facebook often is they put profits over people. It's yeah, that's what companies do, but they obfuscated that for so long, and they did it because they wanted people to work at those companies, and they wanted people to put in long hours and kind of shape their lives around being at the Google campus all day. And I think Google's overall aim used to be these really lofty ambitions around I think there was a quote from Larry Page back in the day that curing cancer was too simple, and they really wanted to cure death. And it was now the big thing that Google is going after is how do we stop our ads business from being spun off into a separate thing? That's a much more honest goal, but it's also a much less attractive one for workers.
Christina, did you want to add on this power dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit touching on what Lauren was saying too about the layoffs. I think another thing that's really shifted is, as we've seen, CEOs sort of take back the power, is that they were competing for workers in a completely different context, until last year basically, than they are now. So when they're laying off tens of thousands of people at a time, they're not it's just a completely different environment in terms of having to, try to attract workers, through ideology and through perks and all these other things. So now it's any reason is good to let go of somebody, or as we saw with Twitter, to, say, well, you just you don't belong here. If you don't align with what we want to do, if you're not, what was this, extremely hardcore.
Yeah.
Extremely hardcore. If you're not extremely hardcore, you don't have a place here. So, that's a really, that's a really big change in dynamic just around the employment.
It's very fast, though. It's happening very quickly. And I want to get to the journalism questions related to the beat, but just to understand, why are there 150,000 tech layoffs in 2022, and there's tens of thousands slated more, Zoe, for next year? Is it the recession?
I mean, I do think that the reality in tech was that there was a lot of bloat. The valuations were incredibly high, and a lot of these companies were not going to live up to that lofty valuation. And so I think we've seen a real pullback. A lot of this is coming from pressure from investors. Investors have been saying, look, these companies have way too many employees. You've gotten really unfocused. And also, you're having these large-scale debates around bias in AI. We really just need you to ship some stuff. And so I think now there's a real fire lit under them where they're saying, look, gone are the political discussions. Gone is the idea of free speech. You have to get focused. This is a company. You have to work for these projects that we tell you. It's top down, once again. And if you don't like it, you can leave, but from a worker perspective, you can't really leave all of a sudden because there aren't that many jobs.
Yeah, and the poor people on the visas that, they have 30 days and then they're, anyway,
Yeah,
it's a
I
good
mean,
story.
we have lots of sources at all of these companies who like desperately want to get out of Twitter or what have you, but they truly, for the first time, very, very senior engineers like cannot find other work in Silicon Valley. That's a highly unusual situation we haven't seen for many years.
So we'll talk about sourcing, but Lauren, I want to pick up on something that you said about hero worship, since we're talking about CEOs. And you had a piece in Wired, Why the World Fell for Sam Bankman-Fried. And the subhead was, despite ample reasons to be skeptical of cryptocurrency schemes, the notion of the eccentric genius accomplishing extraordinary things was irresistible. Then you go on, were there signs that FTX was a house of cards and that maybe its WizKiss founder didn't know which way was up? Yes. So talk about, we're talking about like sort of how CEOs are pivoting. How is the tech journalism industry pivoting after Elizabeth Holmes, Sam Bankman-Fried? Is there any, in Hebrew they say cheshbon nefesh, which is like an accounting, a self-accounting?
If we are pivoting, I think it's not hard enough. There have been some critiques lobbed at tech journalism in recent years coming from the side of the industry, from founders, from venture capitalists who suddenly believe that we're all like skeptics and we hate tech and we don't actually enjoy covering it, which is, I think, a totally false narrative. We do it because we are very interested in it, and I think deep down a lot of us are optimistic and interested in solutions that may be presented, right? Interested in the intricacies of tech and how it's changing our lives. But I actually would say, at the same time, we haven't been skeptical enough. We are still prone to some element of the hero worship of these new characters sort of emerging, and it goes back to what I said earlier about the complexities of tech. When there's something very complex put forth, and we as a society have a hard time understanding how it works, how it's affecting us, whether it's good, whether this is good for the future or bad for the future. We're still like a little bit susceptible to someone coming along and saying, I know the answers. I have the exchange. I'm the intermediary here. I'm the person who's going to write this. I believe that's partly what happened in the case of Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, right? That we're still parsing what the future of cryptocurrency is. If blockchain has a role in our day-to-day lives or is going to help shape this next version of the web, if there is like some sort of optimistic future in decentralized currencies and unregulated digital currencies, and like someone came along and presented an exchange that seemed to many people like a good solution. It wasn't, as we know, and so yeah, I think I'd be interested to hear from Christina too, especially since you manage so many beat reporters. Like, I do wonder if part of that solution needs to be, like, a lot of newsrooms are becoming horizontal. We're covering very, very broad areas, and I wonder if we need more verticalization, we need more experts, we need, like what the folks did at CoinDesk, right? To say, like, something's not right here. I know this tech so well, or I'm so well sourced in this area that something is off. And that, of course, requires a different level of investment, too.
Christina, you were at the Journal during Theranos, right? And
Yes.
were there enough health expert reporters before John Carreyrou came along and did his investigation, like actually questioning the stories they were doing?
So it's so interesting because I think back to that time, and it was like, that was a completely different time in tech journalism. That was a period of a lot of optimism. It was, we talk about like, the billion-dollar startups, and there were only a few, right, at the time, and it was a really big deal if, like, a startup became a unicorn. But I feel like at that point, the companies had so much more power over the narrative. It's interesting to hear Lauren talk about, like, the need for more skepticism, because I think that there has been a lot more, like, I think that kind of Theranos and then the 2016 election with the misinformation on social media, in my mind, those were kind of the two things that burst the bubble, like burst the optimism bubble in technology. But the Theranos, the Theranos coverage, John's scoop about Theranos was he wasn't a tech reporter. He was sourced among like the people who were trying to hold Theranos to account. And so, in a way, it's like, it's not, and I guess in a way it's kind of logical that he would be the one to hear from the people who were in the medical industry, and who had these doubts about what they were seeing. One of the things that I think is so interesting as we think about like FTX and everything now too is like there's so many parallels between Theranos and FTX. One of them is the ultimate belief of the venture capital industry. Not all of them, because of course like there were plenty of firms that passed on Theranos, but plenty of billionaires who did invest in it. And likewise with FTX, I remember that the day that, I think it was that week that FTX went bankrupt, Sequoia, which was like a major investor in FTX, was having a media cocktail. And as I was in the Uber going over to the cocktail, they're like, oh, by the way, we're taking like a full write down on our $215 million investment. And it was very it was very uncanny timing. But if they've put that much money in it and they didn't ask the right questions to figure out what was going on before they got to this point, they have the most access to information, right? More than journalists. Yes, we should be very skeptical, but these are hard things.
That's a huge lesson. That's a huge journalism lesson, because what you're saying is the VCs were the trusted source, and they didn't do their due diligence. So the question for the journalist students coming is when you go to the VCs, how do you know this? What did you do? Show me your documentation. It has to be part of it, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, in the world of sources, right? Let's talk about sourcing. We've got 150,000 people have just been laid off. Their sources, maybe, although Zoe, you say sometimes, or one of you told me, actually they have NDAs and they can't talk, right? And so there's that, and then you have the VCs, and then you have the people at the top, the CEOs and their ilk, who are of course gonna tell you it's amazing, right? Who am I forgetting? Maybe the balance needs to shift in the wake of these two debacles.
Researchers too.
The
researchers at academic institutions like
academics.
this one, right? Yeah.
And I think to the point of a lot of Zoe's wonderful work is that the perspective and the voice of workers has become much more important, right? Thinking about somebody like Frances Haugen, she was
The Facebook whistleblower.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Frances Haugen, household name.
Yes. She was
but
last year. Yeah.
But somebody like that, who maybe in the past, people wouldn't have necessarily listened to a worker in the same way that we now do.
Yeah, but we rely on these people. I mean, to Lauren's point, we need to ask ourselves what we want from technology companies when we're asking them to be more transparent. We saw last week TikTok invited a whole bunch of reporters down, and one of the things was are they going to show you a snippet of the TikTok source code? The reality is that even if they did that, a lot of us are not equipped at this point to actually understand what we're even seeing. And so we do rely on sources to tell us, is this legitimate, what they're putting out, or is there something I should be skeptical of? And I think we always need to have that skepticism, but it does get to that kind of fuzzy aspect of reporting where I think we need to know, is this someone whose perspective I really trust? We love that laid off reporter who just wants to burn it all to the ground and tell us everything, but that person has an axe to grind, and I think we need to really be aware of that. When we're talking to them, versus someone who's at the company, maybe won't give you all of the access that you want, but they've got a very nuanced perspective, and you can bring them kind of snippets of information that you're getting from other people and say hey, I just want to run this by you, and they'll kind of whittle down what you're hearing into something that could be closer to the truth.
The industry is so, look, we have 3 different kinds of journalism here, right? Magazine, traditional newspaper, independent newsletter. And when the New York Times had to do its what would you call it, Phil, a mea culpa, after the Iraq weapons of mass destruction, post-mortem, it was the Times doing it and had a lot of impact. But if the industry wanted to do that kind of version of what did we get wrong in the coverage of, say, SBF, for example, would anybody have the guts to do that, you think, in the tech media world?
I think so. I this isn't exactly the same, but I would point to one example that came up late last year that I think a lot of journalists and editors weighed in on. The Verge ended up publishing this post about like how they were redefining what was on background, and that got a lot of traction. And I know that they sought input before they published that from a lot of journalists, not just within Vox Media, but across the industry. I spoke to them too. And like, that was a moment, so just for those, a lot of folks in here do know what that means, but for those who don't, like when we are speaking with sources, one of the first things we discuss is attribution. Are you willing to go on the record? Is this off the record? Is this on background? Is this on deep background? We sort of lay the ground rules. Both parties have to agree to it. And what a lot of tech companies have been doing, particularly at the level of communications executives, is they would issue statements, but they would go on background, which meant that they were not being named. So here's someone who gets presumably paid lots of money by a giant tech company to help create this sort of shroud of secrecy, and they're putting out a statement, but they never want to be named. Sometimes this is for legitimate safety reasons, if they're afraid they're going to get harassed or doxxed, but for the most part, they just don't want to put their names on things. And we started to reassess, like, sort of collectively, like, how are we going to start handling on background? Because we wanted to start actually naming more tech industry executives, and not let them hide behind, like, you know, anonymous statements. And that was like one instance, I think, where a collective of journalists kind of came together and determined that. And I think that was encouraging, in my opinion.
But to that point, part of the reason that we were having that conversation is that tech executives would come to us and say, well, you let your sources be anonymous sometimes, like, why can't I? Which completely negates like the obvious imbalance of power that they have. Like some low-level worker who's speaking out about an injustice at the company, to me, there are conditions under which anonymity should very much be granted. I think at Twitter we've seen Elon Musk go after individuals in a way that creates a whole bunch of harassment. People have had to leave their homes and have had death threats. Those sources should absolutely be anonymous. I think we have to hold executives and people in the C-suite to a higher and different standard.
So you have a piece, Zoe, on Twitter in New York Magazine that came out about 2 weeks ago, and it said you interviewed 24 former and current employees, and it was about, one of the points was Elon's, quote, remarkable lack of interest in how his new $44 billion toy actually works. But you give a pseudonym to Alicia.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk about that. So you had a negotiation.
Yeah, we had a negotiation. I typically, this is like getting kind of nitty gritty on the journalism side of things, but.
Well, there's a panel on journalism.
Okay,
so
well,
it's
I just like, for the non-journalism students, this might be really boring, but here we go. I typically always start out conversations off the record because I want to give people.
Really?
Because I want people to talk to me first. And I just want to give them the most license to kind of tell me the story, and then I'll say, because I'm often talking to people with the least amount of power at these organizations, let's have an initial conversation, and then after that, we can have a negotiation about what I want to bring on the record. This is like a horrible headache for me every single time, but I do think it means that more people will talk. In this case, the source originally was going to be on the record, and then when Elon Musk started going after individuals at the company, and there was a whole bunch of harassment, she decided she wanted to have a pseudonym. Originally in the piece,
Did you guys get that? People were afraid. They are afraid to speak to the reporter because they were afraid the CEO of the company would tweet about them, and then they'd have to go into hiding, like Yoel Roth had to go into hiding.
And
why is this go on.
Well, I just was going to say, I think as reporters, we're always taught, like, you have to push for on the record without fail, like, to the ends of the earth, and I think we do have to make some decisions. Well, if other people are being named by the CEO and being harassed and having to move out of their apartments, is it really ethical for me to push that person? In this case, it was a mother of two. Like, should I really tell her that she needs to be on the record? I decided, no, I think it makes total sense for her to have a pseudonym. But, and this is something you really pushed me on, like, we have to be very upfront with the reader about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think there are artful ways to do that in the writing. But I think that that's how we create trust.
What Zoe's referring to is an investigation she did for her master's thesis where she had, how many on background?
Like 30, yeah, it was a lot
A
of people.
lot of people on background, but the accusations were so severe that I said, I don't recommend you going out with this like this. You're going to get sued, right?
Yeah, accurate.
Eventually, she did publish it, but with a place where they had lawyers and things, right? They did threaten to sue you.
Yeah, well, that was the whole thing. But
Yeah.
your point was like, do you really want to burn it all to the ground? This was a story about a quote unquote toxic workplace, allegedly toxic workplace, a direct to consumer bra company. And Janine was like, do you really want to burn it all to the ground to write the bra toxic workplace story? And at the time I was like, absolutely,
Yes.
I will die on this hill. Looking back, I'm like, wise. Probably wasn't worth
So for all
it.
you get mad at me, that's why I want to bring that up. Okay, so let's talk about, I make this joke in my classes sometimes that covering Apple is like harder than covering the CIA. And that's because, the way that they just they'll ice you, right? If you don't go to their party, press conference, or whatever you call it, with their invitations, and they get really mad about the coverage. So is there any truth to my joke, Christina?
Oh my gosh, it's just like the fashion industry.
Oh, here we go.
Yes, no, yeah, I mean, yes, yes, the companies take access to their events very seriously. Apple certainly does, others do as well. And, it's interesting because, if we take the example of Apple, it's been a long time since there's been something revolutionarily new in our iPhones. They're kind of incremental improvements, and every year it feels like it becomes more and more of just a long commercial.
Right.
And so every year it raises the question of, what is it that, what do we need to tell readers out of this moment that does attract a lot of information, or a lot of attention, so we do have a lot of conversations around that. But yes, they will, the companies will cut off coverage. We got cut off once for bringing in candy bars to an event so that we could compare the size of the phone to candy bars.
What?
It was considered disrespectful.
Oh, disrespectful. The, another exercise sometimes I do in one of my classes is I'll put up an article about, iPhone 10 or 12 or whatever, 14, what are they? I'm an Android old person. So 14 released. And I say to the class, is this news? Is this news? Well, news is something that's new, so it's a new model, and it's something that people care about. I'm sure it gets a lot of hits. But could you imagine a world where the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wired, whatever, says, we are not doing any more stories about your incremental release because that's PR? Mm-hmm. So is it news? Lauren, is it news when
No, this is a great question. And just to add to what Christina said too, one of the really interesting things that Apple has done as a company is it's really silos its employees. There are people who may be friends outside of work, at Apple, and they don't know what each other is working on because it is so secretive there. And Apple is one of those companies too that now employees are so invested in many instances, quite literally invested, that I had someone say to me once, why would I talk to you about what's coming out in the iPhone? It's going to pay for my kids' college.
Explain that. Explain what you mean by that.
Meaning that this person had so much stock in Apple as a longtime employee that anything that the news could potentially, that news outlets could potentially report that would affect the value of the stock on any given day would send this person's shares potentially plummeting, and then that's how they're going to pay for their college. By the way, this person does not work on the iPhone. Apple, you will never figure out who I'm talking about. But that's the thing with Apple. You could work on a tool that builds the componentry that goes into the SoC that goes into the phone, and you have no idea what anyone else is working on in the company. So that's one of the really interesting things about Apple and some other tech companies too. But to your question about whether or not that's news, it's news if you are following the markets. It's news if you're maybe following perhaps how phone sales are doing broadly. Have we reached peak smartphone? Is the market saturated? And therefore, how is that affecting Apple's earnings? And then when you look at their earnings and you look at whether or not they haven't laid people off yet, but if they do, those things, there are trend lines that you should be following. But I think you're totally right, Janine, in that era of iOS 16.1 adds this feature relative to iOS 16.0. No, it's part of a bigger trend story, but that is not the news. Shouldn't be paying journalists in your newsroom to just file endless stories about that.
Now
Works
we have
for some-
ChatGPT to write it all for us.
Right now,
anyway,
and now we
so-
have ChatGPT to do our sports scores and our earnings reports, and
All right, we'll
we're all
send
just gonna level up.
ChatGPT to
Right.
the next iPhone 15. So we're going to come back to ChatGPT and AI and all that, but we're on the moments away from the State of the Union, and so I flicked earlier at this question of, is this the year that Washington's going to get tough on Silicon Valley? And apropos, AI and stuff, and I just keep thinking of the late Senator Orrin Hatch with, Mark Zuckerberg there. How do you make money, Senator? We sell ads. They're still figuring out Twitter, and now we're, now they have to understand AI. Anyway, can they regulate? Are you expecting whether it be through, any kind of specific antitrust or? Christina, I'm looking at you.
I know.
I'm looking at you as
As
the
the
Washington
Washington
Post.
representative here.
Yeah.
I feel like that question of is this the year lawmakers are going to get tough on tech is something we ask the beginning of every year.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we just, finished having the entire Congress controlled by one party, and they did not pass the legislation that was the most likely to pass. So, and tomorrow morning we have a hearing in the House about Twitter that is not actually a hearing of current Twitter executives, but another public tarring and feathering of former Twitter executives. So I think it remains a really tough environment for regulation of tech. We did publish a story late on Friday, which is not optimal publishing time, but it was a scoop about that what Biden was going to say tonight in his State of the Union is really trying to get bipartisan support against tech and really calling for regulation. So, we'll see if that works. There's also a lot of infighting politically about, between the GOP and Democrats about who's closer to tech and who's the real enemy of technology. And so I think it's not an easy thing. I think the point about, how do lawmakers become smart about technology is so fascinating. And it's true that people have become smarter about technology in recent years, but the conversation is still about, privacy. It's about kids' access to technology. And in China, they have legislation passed about AI and about it's just so much more sophisticated than what is even really up for debate in the US. And so I think that's really interesting.
You're talking about using the old mechanisms of Washington to litigate in a new world of new inventions and things. So I'm thinking the Washington Post has an amazing scoop last August with another whistleblower. For some reason, it didn't get the same kind of attention that the Facebook did, but it was about Twitter, where Peter Zatko was accusing the former CEO of Twitter, Parag Agrawal, of lying about what the company was actually doing to curb certain malfeasance on the hacking and whatnot. And so you have the SEC, you have antitrust. Maybe we can muscle this regulation into antitrust.
To me, we really have to differentiate between the kind of performative hearings that are kind of more about political censorship, as it were, and largely aren't evidence-based that we're seeing again and again. They drag these CEOs up, they ask them really unsophisticated questions. And then the antitrust cases that the Department of Justice is filing right now. Those, to me, they're having people who've worked in the tech industry work on them, and I think that's what places like Google are actually very worried about. So is it going to move fast enough to regulate OpenAI by the time ChatGPT becomes even more widely available? No, it's not, but there is, I think, a compelling case to be made that Google could have to spin off its ad business this year, which would have enormous implications for the entire industry.
So I started out by talking about the acronyms, and we said, is this the year of the regulation? So is this next coming year the year of AI? Is it the year of AR, VR, which I know you write a lot about, Lauren?
So I am not particularly optimistic about the notion of the metaverse as it was presented in, let's just call it 2022. I do think that there's a future somewhere for AR and VR. But this idea that we're going to be doing all of our socializing in some digital virtual world, or that it's going to become a really valid solution for extended periods of work doesn't seem to ring true to me. I think it's going to be really application specific. I do think the story of this year is going to be related to AI, which, by the way, is not a new story. It's a decades-old story. But what we've seen happen, I think, in recent years with evolutions in computing is that, like with cloud, cloud computing, right, the rise of AWS and Azure for Microsoft and Google Cloud. And then for a while, there was a period of time where like big data literally led the Google search terms for the year, and people were like, what is big data? And then there's like the metaverse, right? There's a lot of like intangibility to these things. They are the underpinnings of like all the tech we're using right now and all the stuff that's in our pockets. But we haven't really been able to get and AI is in that category too, which is AI is just really, really fancy math. Like we haven't been able to get our hands around, our heads or our hands on it. And now with these consumer applications like ChatGPT and Google Bard and Microsoft Bing, as announced this morning, like these are things that consumers are going to be actively using. And that, I think, is what is like, it does feel like a tipping point for that it's something we can get our hands around. Like this evolution in tech has been happening where every tech company now is a digital services company. Even if you make hardware, you are a services company. You provide software and you're looking for recurring revenue. And I think that's the thing that all of us have to get smarter about and our regulators have to get smarter about in order to like better understand how we're actually going to like control it, really.
So you're bearish about AR, VR, metaverse. What about TikTok, which you wrote a fantastic piece, Lauren wrote a fantastic piece, which I commend to you, where she tried to just use TikTok for search for a whole week.
Yeah, this is
I
what
won't
the kids
spoil
are
the
doing.
ending, but I was stunned in the
I heard
piece
kids laughing.
that you said 2021, TikTok overtook Google as the most visited web domain.
This is true. This is according to Cloudflare.
And 40% of young people are using TikTok for basic search.
That was Google's own internal data. An executive said at a conference last year, he basically said he was worried because young people were turning to Instagram and TikTok for search.
So
It's
is TikTok, ByteDance, China, that story?
Well, from a user perspective, it's not a search portal in that it leads you to the open web. It leads you to more TikTok. I mean, that's what TikTok search is for. So if you're looking for 15-second video increments to provide answers for you, and by the way, not necessarily from trusted sources, then sure, I think it proved valuable at times. Yeah, the big question there is absolutely going to be whether or not TikTok as an entity adheres to the principles or promises that it has laid out to keeping U.S. user data on servers that are run by U.S. companies. I am not following deeply the geopolitics of TikTok. So with TikTok, it's really hard to know how much of the concern is political grandstanding, how much of it is valid, whether or not there are folks in government who have some knowledge of something going on with TikTok that we don't fully understand yet. Yeah, just from a pure user perspective, I mean, it is alarmingly popular among younger generations of users. And so I think that alone is worth keeping tabs on, I guess.
Yeah, it could be that the China geopolitics, will propel this to the front of the Washington agenda, maybe.
With all of these platforms, there's going to be concern about whether or not it becomes a vehicle for misinformation and political messaging.
Interestingly, like the Chinese surveillance balloon did not play in a Chinese propaganda way on TikTok. So it was actually just kind of the American point of view is what.
Oh, you're being sarcastic.
No, I'm not. Like, I'm really not. Like, it was.
What were you expecting?
Well, there were a lot of people who thought that maybe, we were going to see.
Oh, like China would be like a robust defense.
That way that news event would play on TikTok would be favorable to the Chinese government. And in fact, that is not what happened.
Matt DeButz will explain this later to us. Okay. I'm going to go to the questions in a moment, but just to wrap up my portion here, again, like independent versus legacy media, and I want to talk about the trade-offs, because a lot of people are thinking about where do I go work, what do I do? For those of you who don't know, Zoe, not surprisingly, completely crushed it with her live tweeting coverage of the Elon Musk takeover and everything, like tweeting through the night. I was so proud of her. I was like felling, I was crying, I was like so excited. And that was really tough to do, right? Because we talked about maintaining your access in these places, and maybe it was a kind of nimbleness that you couldn't have had if you have to go through the bureaucity of the Washington Post, you know? So,
No, the Washington Post had many great
but let's
scoops
talk
during that
about
experience, so.
the trade-offs, like what an independent media. I mean, then you have to do platform, or I don't know if you get the same reach of a Washington Post. So,
I mean, yeah, I think inherently we're obviously going to be smaller. So we run an independent investigative newsletter that comes out 3 days a week through Substack. And then we can write big features for New York Magazine or The Verge as we have them. But I think, yeah, we can be, it's just me and my co-writer, Casey, so we can be extremely fast. We have our own kind of criteria for when we feel good enough about a scoop to tweet it out, but I mean, there's just literally 2 of us, so as soon as we're ready to go, we can have it out. And I think with Twitter, we really felt like so many of the scoops weren't going to hold that we wanted to tweet it out first and kind of plant a flag that we had the news, and then follow up with a deeper dive later. And I still have a question about whether that's the right approach, because sometimes I feel like, yeah, you can be first, your tweet can go viral, but like you don't have that kind of deeply reported story, and maybe you try and like put it all together in a big feature later on. But I think there is something to be said for like holding your scoops for that big investigation. This was just a news cycle in which we felt like we couldn't do it because stuff was happening so fast. But I'm curious on your take.
Oh my gosh, I mean, yes, the news was happening so fast. It was incredible, especially those like first 2 or 3 weeks. It was just, yeah, it was just nonstop. It's really an interesting question, you know, about like, yes, when do you put out the scoop? Like, where do you put it out, you know? So we definitely, I would say, okay, so first of all, yes, we're a legacy news organization, not newspaper.
Pardon me.
And like, but it's true that, you know, I mean, like, our whole tech team has come up, like, we're super digital first, like, we don't even get the print paper out here. So like, we really are thinking, like, we do think about like our website first and foremost. And so, you know, something breaks, but we want to publish that first, like, on our site, as opposed to Twitter. And it's really interesting because there is this competition to get the news out there first. But one of the things that I think about a lot is like, well, like if you're going to put it out on Twitter, before you have a story to link to, like, whose platform are you driving information to? Like, you know, if somebody just sees our scoop on Twitter, for instance, and doesn't visit the Washington Post, like, that's not really I don't think that's like very good for the news organization. So
yeah, what's the value to the Washington Post in that tweet?
It can be good for your personal brand, though.
Well, your personal
yes,
brand.
That's kind of the
right?
question.
Yes, yeah. I mean, these are things that like we're all figuring out all the time, every day long, and the answers are not easy, you know, because yes, there is value in the personal brand, but like where that kind of line is between the personal brand and the news organization is, you know, it's not easy.
What about you, Lauren? You have an active social media presence. How do you see it as a tool, or, you know?
I have reevaluated this relationship to social media recently. I mean, Elon Musk buying Twitter was certainly a part of that. And for what it's worth, I've seen my Twitter follower count dwindle just a little bit since then. So whether he's actually getting rid of bots or whether or not it's just that there's lower engagement overall, it's really hard to say. This is like, you know, a data set of 1. But I have found it to be incredibly useful for reporting over the years, because I think what people see on Twitter is, of course, what we publicly tweet out there, but it also allows you to engage in conversations with some of your readers. I use DMs for sourcing sometimes. Usually then I ask to take it to a more secure platform. But yeah, people like sometimes feel like they get to know you a little bit and feel like they know what you're interested in and what you are writing about through a place like Twitter or Instagram, and so then they might actually seek you out. So I would say still the balance for me tips more into, like, it's definitely like more beneficial than it is harmful at this point, but it's not to say it's going to remain that way forever. I also am, like, for what it's worth, like, very much a loyalist to my publications typically. So like if I had a big scoop, I probably wouldn't tweet it before I published it to site first. That said, it's like I say that like, scoops. I don't get that many scoops. But if I did, I would.
Well, this
hold
is
it
a
for
big
wider.
issue right now in Washington journalism too, with some certain books that they save the scoops for the book, and what's your
right,
responsibility to your readers and such.
Right.
We have some great questions from the audience. I'm so excited. But Lauren, you just said something about, your number went down. So obviously it got rid of some bots maybe, or people were just disgusted by Musk and got off. But I
Maybe
had
people just don't like me, which is totally fine too. It's their business.
One of the things you told me in our prep call was, I said, what are you focused on? And you're like, I'm focused on so much fakeness.
Yes.
And so I thought fakeness might be the story of 2023. And then I learned a new phrase, which maybe my students know, but I'd never heard it. The pig butchering scams.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So how many people know what the pig butchering scams are? Enlighten us. Fakeness and pig butchering. This is what you're spending your days on.
Yes, so this was a story that I wrote about Hinge, which is a dating app that's owned by the Match Group, which if you weren't aware, Match Group owns tons of dating apps. They pretty much own like everything that you've probably heard of except for Grindr and Bumble. But they own Tinder, Hinge, Plenty of Fish, the list goes on and on. So I discovered an alarming number of fake accounts on Hinge, and ended up writing a story about it, and in reporting out that story learned that scams have sort of evolved from like the Nigerian prince email scam that many of us are familiar with from back in the day, to like catfishing on dating apps, which is typically like a real human being purporting to be someone else, to like, then there's sort of these like fast moving like spammy sort of attacks, right? Where the idea is to just send you like a malicious link and get you sucked in right away. And then there's pig butchering, which is typically more of like a long con scam where someone uses some kind of fake imagery, purports to be someone else, but then actually sparks up a long-term relationship with you via text message, and then eventually gets you to share your valid financial credentials, or in some cases your crypto key. And this is like a real thing that's happening. People have been scammed out of, there was one story, I believe it was in the Washington Post, of a woman who got scammed out of $300,000 from a pig butchering scam on Hinge. And so, yeah, this is a valid thing that's happening now.
Okay.
Or I should say invalid thing that's happening now.
So there's a really good question here about, and I know that journalists are notoriously bad at this because I researched this, but what you do to protect yourselves from hacking. There's Pegasus software. Anybody can spy on us. You, Lauren, in one of your pieces, a little bit tongue-in-cheek about how you're part of this like experiment with tech, right? They're tracking what you're searching. But in terms of like actual protections for yourselves, are there things that you do in terms of digital hygiene? You don't need to reveal it, but just wondering, yes, no, kind of. Is that something you think about, or are journalists just bad at that?
We've had to have like a real institutional response to this because like a fair number of reporters on my team have been doxxed and otherwise attacked online, and so we use a program we subscribe to a program called Delete Me, which goes and wipes all of your personal information from online. So I led a campaign last year to make sure that we got a large corporate subscription to it and got every person on my team subscribed.
Mm-hmm. Anything happening at Wired or for you?
We use that too.
Yeah.
We have a stipend from the company to support our Delete Me accounts. I would say I've been very bad about this. If I could go back and do my tech reporting career over again, go back 15 years, I would have used what is now known as a digital twin. I would have created like a totally different sort of persona, using a different Gmail, using a different phone number, using a different everything to like sign up for all of these apps, because I've tested hundreds of apps over the years, and in many cases I've used my own personal credentials. So a lot of people out there have my phone number, and like, is that ultimately going to come back and haunt me? Maybe. I gave my phone number to one of the pig butchering scammers in Southeast Asia. Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. But regardless, yeah, and I try to use encrypted messaging apps whenever possible.
Crypto
That's my main
messaging,
thing.
Signal, whatever, anything.
Yeah.
A lot of questions here about ChatGPT, and so maybe we just come back to that for a moment in terms of, I guess we already covered sort of the DC regulation, but what are your hopes and fears for the future of journalism with these emergent, like basically, are we all going to be out of work?
I mean, I think Max Reed was right that anytime we see a story about ChatGPT augmenting the work of journalists, we can like pretty much assume that it's actually a labor automation story. Like to me, I think the idea that these tools are going to be used to free up time for us all to do investigative reporting is like another version of a very old story that we've heard again and again from media outlets and always ends up with mass layoffs. So I think we need to be very wary of that. You know, we're already seeing publications rely on ChatGPT and other automated tools to write a whole host of coverage. But one interesting thing that I don't have an answer to, but it's just something I'm paying attention to, is these sites are creating content to optimize for an SEO world so they can rank higher in Google search results, while at the same time ChatGPT is the first existential threat that Google search has had in many, many years. And I think we don't know how ChatGPT is going to rank articles. And so as that becomes a more prominent search tool for us, will it be less likely that all of a sudden we're going to just maximize for like the most content? I don't know.
I have totally been thinking about this because yes, if with ChatGPT you get just one answer, and who's to say that that answer is even cites a news organization, for instance? You know, the way that we get information through Google search, where you get a list of links and you can look at and see, like, you know, maybe you trust one news outlet over another, and that's part of the calculation that you make in clicking on that link. Like, all of that could go away with ChatGPT. I mean, and to be fair, all of that can also go away when, you know, you get one answer from asking a voice assistant a search question. But it really does feel, I mean, I am like worried about, I am worried about, like, you know, a news brand in the era of like generative AI search.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are very important questions around the veracity of the results that you're getting from these, you know, chatbots, and whether or not that can produce truthful and accurate information. I think there's another question I have, which is, if these tools ultimately do become our new search engines, then what does that mean for SEO in the digital advertising market? Because we could have also looked at Google, you know, developed here with panic, as many people did, and say, what is this going to mean for news? And like, what it meant for news wasn't necessarily about the content itself, but it totally changed the advertising market that supports our businesses. So right now, we're still in sort of like the content creation phase of these AI-powered chatbots, but what happens when we get to the monetization phase? That's like something I don't know the answer to, but I have a lot of questions around.
Okay, for a future panel, Professor Hamilton told me it's too soon, so I think he agrees. Zoe, for Zoe, you said you were focused on producing as many clips as you could while a master's student here. What were some of your best practices that enabled you to write so many stories on such an opaque industry while still a student?
Honestly, Simone should answer this question because he's really the gold standard for freelancing at the best outlets when he was here. And I would honestly benchmark myself. I was like, by this time in the year, he was writing for The Atlantic, so I failed. But I felt really certain when I came into the program that I wanted every single thing I wrote to be published elsewhere as well, because I felt like if I wanted to come out of the program with a list of clips that I could use to like tell an editor that they should hire me, then I really wanted to do it at those outlets and use the experience to like make connections in the industry that I felt like for so long was this like closed party that I could kind of like look into but couldn't get in the room. So this, I don't know if this is an okay answer, but I was like, there were some classes that I put a whole lot of effort into and felt like I was gonna write a big feature article with, some of those professors are in the room, and then there were others that I felt like I'm not gonna be this type of journalist, and so I'm just not gonna focus on it as intently. For me, that worked. I don't know if it's an approach I would like recommend, but I did come out of the program with probably like 6 to 10 articles that I'd published for Vox and other outlets, and then I was able to go to those editors and ask for a job and ultimately get one.
No, I think one of the things we talk about with the journalists is, you know, we have, you know, here at Stanford are, you know, we learn how to write and report, and we learn how to do data, and we learn to do multimedia, and VRAR, you layer that on, and like, not everybody's gonna do all those things extremely well or even want to, right?
Yeah.
So, but you have the opportunity to learn it all. So
Yeah, absolutely. I really wanted to be a features writer, and we had great professors in the program who could help with that and your investigative reporting. So that was my focus while I was here.
Lauren, you were here ages ago already, though.
Ages ago?
Yeah.
It feels that way.
9 years,
It was about a
years.
decade ago.
I
entered
know.
in
So, I mean,
2013.
how do you feel about it?
Feel about what exactly?
I mean, like that you were here and what you learned here and what you took away and how it helped you.
It's funny, Jay and I were just chatting about this. So I did a thing that I don't encourage anyone else to ever do, which is I worked full-time through the full-time program. So I felt
We discourage that.
Yes, and everyone did discourage me, and I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. And it wasn't necessarily the best decision because I wasn't able to immerse myself in some of the, I don't know, the peripherals of the program that would have been like really, really great to have gotten more involved in. I think at the time I wanted to learn a little bit more data journalism. It felt like a year was too short to really dive into that. But for me, it was good because, especially your public, what was it called? Public reporting class? Public,
What do we call it, Jay?
yeah,
Public
what was it
affairs?
called? One of my favorite stories was, so I had been
It was
reporting
called Public
on-
Affairs back then, I
Public
guess.
affairs, that's what
Yeah,
it was.
whatever.
I'd been reporting on consumer tech, and I hadn't ever really done like local reporting or like reported on municipalities, and that was something that your class gave me the opportunity to do. And I will never forget, it was a drought year. It was a very severe drought that year, and I had been dispatched to report on how farmers in Central Valley were dealing with this. Do you remember this? And so I came back to Janine with my notes, and I said, well, I talked to one cattle farmer, and he said that he has grass-fed cattle, and so he's like reducing his inventory. And she said, well, by how much? And I said, well, he's reducing his inventory by 50%, he said. And she wrote down, okay, so he's killing half his cows. And I said, no, he's not, he's reducing his inventory. And she said, what do you think that means? He's killing his cows. And I said, I was horrified. I was like, wait, that's what that, and so it was like, for me, it was like a master class, and like, just get the specific details, get like what that really means. And anyway, I really loved my experience here. I wish I could do it again and do it for longer and go in a million different directions.
Eliminating jargon is definitely
Eliminating
a big
jargon.
focus of RB
Yes.
in my classes for sure. All right, so we're just about out of time. So with the last, thank you everybody who turned in questions, but just for a wrap-up question for everybody, how do you see the mission of the tech reporter in Silicon Valley in 2023?
Christina, what would you tell your reporters?
Yes, what's their mission?
I mean, at the Post, the way that we define our mission, but I think that it's, I think it's broadly applicable. And but at the Post, it's the reason that, we've gotten so much into tech journalism is that the Post mission is to hold power to account. And tech is as powerful as any government, as any entity. So, I think that this year, I mean, we are already in the year of AI, right? There's a lot to understand. One of the things, I think that one of the things that's kind of pushing a lot of this coverage forward is that there is a lot of public interest in it. There's just a lot of curiosity about it. It's tangible, right? And we haven't seen anything like that in a long time. Somebody recently, we were workshopping a headline about something about AI, and somebody said, it's magic. And I was like, no. I'm very opposed to headlines about it's magic, or it's, mysterious, or it's a black box, because it's not. It's math, and we need to all understand it. As journalists, we need to understand it. As the public, we need to understand it, because it is here, and it is changing our world now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Such a good answer. It's tough. That's a tough follow. Zoe?
I mean, that is a tough follow. That's largely what I would say. I think holding power to account, and I don't think that mission has changed as the technology has changed. I think part of that for me is always telling the stories of the people with the least amount of power. And a lot of times, they're the people who feel the impact first of the fallout of choices that tech CEOs are making.
Mm-hmm. Lauren, last word.
Yeah, to piggyback on what Christina and Zoe said, subject matter expertise. Zoe, you're obviously very good at it. You're so zeroed in on your B. And Christina, your answer, I think, just did a beautiful job of describing that. Have subject matter expertise. Really zero in to all of the research and reporting that you can on a particular area, because that's the best way to tackle it, I think.
Okay, I want to thank everybody who was watching us online, our 2023 Rebele Symposium on Covering Tech. Thank you to everybody who joined us. We have refreshments here. Maybe you can have a chance to mingle with our panelists. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.